The moment Joe Rogan began speaking, the world was already holding its breath. Overnight, tensions between two of the most powerful militaries on Earth exploded into full-scale conflict. And as the dust settled on the first round of strikes, Iran struck back in ways few analysts saw coming. It began with a series of joint US and Israeli military strikes aimed at crippling the Iranian leadership and strategic capabilities. In the early hours of the offensive, airstrikes and missile barrages hit deep inside Iranian territory, targeting key military infrastructure, missile sites, and command centers. The strikes were so extensive that Iranian state media later confirmed the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a seismic event in the country's modern history. Iran's response was swift and unmistakable. As dawn broke over the Middle East, Iran launched retaliatory strikes against American and Israeli assets across the region. Ballistic missiles and drone barrages struck U.S. bases in multiple Gulf Arab states, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, while missiles also rained down on Israeli territory. Casualties were reported on both sides, with reports of civilian deaths in urban areas such as near Jerusalem and in parts of the UAE after Iranian strikes expanded beyond strictly military targets. Rogan didn't just present this as another headline. He walked his audience through the raw, unfiltered mechanics of how retaliation unfolded, from the political calculus that led Tehran to respond, to the strategic reasons why Iran chose to strike far beyond its own borders. He began by acknowledging what everyone watching the world news already knew, that Iran's retaliation was not merely symbolic, but operational. Iran's leadership, reeling from the loss of Khamenei and senior commanders, vowed revenge and made clear that they would answer force with force. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian characterized retaliation as a legitimate duty and right, language indicating not just rhetoric, but intent to escalate military responses. Rogan explained that in Tehran's calculus, resting without answering a blow of this magnitude would be seen internally as weakness, with profound ramifications for the regime's legitimacy. Within hours of Iran's first counterattacks, missiles were reported crossing the skies toward Israeli population centers, and Gulf Arab nations that host U.S. military bases, once considered relatively secure, found themselves targeted directly. Countries such as the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait reported impacts from Iranian strikes that forced evacuations, reinforced defenses, and condemnation from governments seeking to avoid becoming unwilling battlegrounds in a confrontation they did not start. Rogan didn't sensationalize this moment, he contextualized it. He reminded listeners that modern conflict rarely stays localized. Each retaliatory strike is not just a military reaction, but a signal, a message encoded in explosions and radar pings. Iran's strikes, he explained, were sending a multifaceted signal, that retaliation is possible at distance, that U.S. bases in the region are within reach, and that proxy relationships extend Iran's reach well beyond its borders. That's why, as Rogan described it, the global response was so sharp. This was no isolated skirmish. Gulf states were condemning attacks in their cities and airspaces were closing in response to missile barrages. Airlines canceled flights. Global markets reacted. Every oil price ticker and shipping index began trending upward because the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy corridors, lay alarmingly close to the epicenter of these clashes. But Rogan didn't stop at what had already happened. He asked his audience, quietly, what happens next once retaliation has already begun? He explained that while Iran's missile and drone capabilities may not match America's technologically, they serve a broader purpose: deterrence through disruption. Iran's capacity to launch strikes into neighboring states and U.S. bases complicates any straightforward military victory. Ballistic missiles are unpredictable in terms of defense saturation. Drones are cheap and hard to track. Crowded urban environments make interception errors all too possible. The script of escalation, as he laid it out, follows psychological lines as much as tactical ones. When one side strikes decisively and the other responds emphatically, audiences, both political and public, begin to view further action as inevitable rather than preventable. Rogan stressed that such escalation does not require a formal declaration of war to become a war of attrition. He reminded listeners that this isn't theoretical. In previous conflicts, Iran has responded to strikes with missile attacks on allied bases in the region. While those earlier engagements were more limited, they established a pattern of retaliation that was likely to reappear once the threshold of direct strikes on Iranian leadership was crossed. Rogan's explanation also addressed the broader international reaction that was unfolding in real time. European nations were calling for restraint, even as the United Nations Security Council met amid crisis. China condemned the attacks and urged a ceasefire, highlighting the international anxiety over how far this confrontation might spread. He warned that in this environment, global alliances and international law become both shields and flashpoints. Condemnation by one major world power calls for diplomacy by another, economic sanctions, evacuation advisories, and global airspace closures all become interlocking threads in a conflict tapestry that no single actor can easily control. Rogan pulled back the lens further still to consider economic implications. He explained that when the world's second largest energy corridor is threatened, supply concerns ripple outward through markets. Oil prices rise, shipping insurance skyrockets, and panic can feed panic, creating a cascade of indirect crises even for regions far from the battlefield. Perhaps most strikingly, Rogan didn't present the retaliation as inevitable escalation toward a global war. He described it as a landscape of possibilities, each far more complex than most news cycles allowed. There is diplomatic pressure on both sides to avoid further bloodshed. There are regional alliances with conflicting interests. There are internal dynamics within Iran that could push hardliners or moderates to favor different paths. There are concerns among Gulf Arab states, who host U.S. forces but do not want to be battlegrounds, about their own security and sovereignty. And there are unintended consequences. Retaliatory strikes that miss their intended military targets and hit civilian infrastructure can inflame public sentiment, harden opposition, and create long-term cycles of grievance that outlast any immediate conflict. In his closing, Rogan reminded listeners that retaliation isn't just a military reaction. It's a strategic choice that echoes through politics, markets, societies, and alliances. Whether this moment settles into tense standoff or spirals into wider engagement depends as much on diplomatic channels and backroom negotiations as it does on missile trajectories. As he spoke, the world was still waiting for the next headlines. The global reaction, from governments urging restraint to analysts debating the next moves, showed why this moment has become so pivotal. Retaliation had already transformed the situation from isolated strikes to a cascading confrontation involving multiple nations, civilian populations, and the fragile balance of regional peace. By the time the episode ended, Rogan had not offered simple answers or certainty. Instead, he offered clarity about complexity, and that was what surprised and shocked his audience most of all. Because in a time when fear and speculation dominate headlines, Rogan chose to explore not only what happened, but why it matters, and how the world might look once the echoes of retaliation have fully run their course.